Hello and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be replacing the cord on both versions of the original Xbox controllers. The bigger Fat Duke and the smaller S controller like this one here. These tend to get damaged right where the cords come out of the controller from repeated bending or the improper wrapping of the cords. You can see that this one moves really easily and even has a flat spot where it folds over. The flat spot even has a different feel to it compared to the rest of the cord, which is a telltale sign that it is damaged inside. I'll show you what one of those looks like inside a little later, but let's get into the first repair. I've already tested this S controller and the console doesn't even register it being plugged in, but since we are replacing it anyway, I'm going to cut it off so it's easier to work with. These controllers have a total of 7 screws holding them together, and one is hidden underneath the label on the back. You can peel this label back carefully by pulling up a corner with your knife. The plus side by doing it this way is it doesn't badly damage the label, and after we are done with it, it will stick back down and looks much more original this way too. Take the rear cover off carefully with the circuit board still inside the housing and the face or front of the controller down on the table. This prevents any buttons from flying out and makes it easier to reassemble later. It also looks like we have a dead friend inside this controller. I'll get that removed and disposed of, but this controller is from a broken lot I bought on eBay a while ago, so I'm sure yours won't have this issue. It's still not a bad idea to clean the inside with some high percentage isopropyl alcohol at this point though. The housing is already open, so you might as well get the inside cleaned up while you're here. You'll need to pop the circuit board out of the rear housing to get at the cord end too. The top of the cord is just press fit in place, but the bottom is soldered in. Take note that the red wire is on the bottom of this connector, and when we install the new cord, it will need to go in the same configuration. But start by desoldering the connector points from the opposite side of the board. I like to use a desoldering ribbon for this and move along one by one until the solder is all wicked away. Then go back and push down while heating each of the pins to push them out of the holes. The connector will either fall out by itself or wiggle loose from the other side pretty easily at this point. If it doesn't, just reheat and remove some additional solder from the points on the board. Clean up the area when you're done with some IPA and grab your new cord. These are almost exact replacements and even have the little V-shaped pins on the connectors too. These are helpful because once they are pushed into place, they stay in place. Remember to put the red wire towards the bottom when installing. Then add your solder to the connection points on the opposite side. Unlike my previous controller cord replacement video where we used a cut controller cable from a spare parts bin, this is a much easier option. And that's the hardest part done. Now on to the reassembly. Reinstall the thumbsticks at this point if you remove them and slide your circuit board into the front of the controller shell instead of the rear first. It should fit nicely together and may even snap into place since there are screw hole studs that lock the board into the proper location. Make sure to place the rumble motors in the correct locations so the wires are not stressed or pinched when installing the rear cover too. Also make sure the new cord is held in place on the back of the board at the top. Then slide the back cover in place carefully to make sure nothing is getting pinched. You can add all your screws back in place and check your work at this point. The cord should be positioned in the middle of the controller and not cockeyed or at an angle at all. Test it to make sure the connections are all good, and you're all done. Now before we get into replacing the cord on the Duke controller, let's dissect a cord that had this same slightly more pronounced flat spot. Cutting away the outer insulation and removing the inner cable shielding yields the same wires that you see attached to the connector before. But as you can see, these don't look so good. The thinner green, white, and yellow wires are all for data transfer, but the thicker black and red wires are for power. Since these are thicker, they tend to bend and break faster than the data wires, which would explain a lack of connection between the console and the controller. That's not to say the data wires can't be broken, but it probably happens less than with the power wiring. The red wire even has what looks like some scorch marks on the insulation and pulls free without much effort too. The black wire still seems to be intact, but broken strands on these wires can still cause failures, so please wrap your cords without stressing the ends and it will avoid this problem from even happening in the first place. Let's move on to the Duke controller. It's a very similar process to the S controller, but the guts are a little different and I'll give you some tips for a proper install. First tip, do not under any circumstances use a power tool to remove the 7 screws from the back of the housing. The torque of a power screwdriver has the potential to damage the inner housing. As these housings age, the plastic becomes very brittle. The inner screw studs will break loose if you're not careful, and using a regular screwdriver lessens this but doesn't make it go away completely. Even with me being careful, I broke 3 on this housing and had to glue them in place for reinstall later. I just used super glue, which works great, but keep this in mind when opening these shells. Tip number 2. Open these in the same way you would the S controller, with the front facing down to avoid the buttons from falling out. The circuit boards are attached inside the rear housing, so it's easier to remove than the S controller. Then remove the circuit board by unscrewing these 4 screws. The other 2 in the middle can stay in place since they are for the memory card assembly. Tip 3. Carefully remove your rumble motors with a fingernail or a small tool to pry at the connectors. These rumbles are screwed down and attached to the insides of the rear housing, so they have to be popped out of their connectors to get access to the cable on the back of the circuit board. With this controller, I'm also swapping the rear housing since it was damaged on the right side, and I have a donor housing for that. Tip number 4. When you go to remove the cord from the back, cut it off in the middle first. This frees up the memory card holder and the entire piece can be slid out. Trust me, it's much easier to work with it this way. Tip number 5. Take note of the cord connector and the red wire location. It is on the far left this time, so when you reinstall your new cord, make sure it is placed in the correct spot. Tip number 6. Get something to prop up your board from underneath when you solder or desolder the connector. I'm using a little toolkit case to hold the board up while I'm working. This helps to keep it supported and level so it's easier to work on the connector. You can even solder in your new one this way too. Tip 7. This is optional, but I like to remove the thumbsticks before soldering because you can't buy replacements for them. I have looked everywhere online and haven't been able to find anyone who sells replacement thumbsticks for these Duke controllers. If someone knows a place to buy them from, please leave a comment down below so I can put a link in the description. In the event that you slip while you're working, you may want to remove them so they don't get accidentally damaged because you can't replace them. Tip number 8. Put the memory card housing and cord holder back together in parts. Slide the memory card holder in place first, then attach the plastic cord tensioner just past the heat shrink tubing of the new cord. Then while holding the card holder in place, carefully slip the cord tensioner into the back and press it up to seat it into position. I've found this is the best way to do it while also making sure the cord is properly secured in the back too. You're all but finished at this point. Just need to reinstall each of the rumble motors, pop in the board screws, reinstall the thumbsticks if you took them off, and sandwich everything together with the front housing. Remember, don't torque the screws down too much either. These are fragile and the insides can still snap if pushed on too hard. And that's it. Now you have new cords installed on your controllers. I hope you enjoyed this little tutorial and thank you for watching. Now I'm going to go clean up these dirty controllers. We'll see you next fix.